Good morning, everyone. My name is Carolyn Hart Bennett, and today I'm going to read chapter 38 from the third leg of the 5,000-mile journey that the Seven Sisters take from London, England to Salt Lake City. And it's entitled Seven Sisters, The Trek, chapter 38. When the Dixie train traveled from Pacific Springs the next day, true to the warning of the leaders, the scouts didn't find a camping spot with any water. The Saints were traveling through the South Pass, and the springs from the Continental Divide ran to the southwest of there and sank into the dry desert ground. All the water barrels from their wagons were filled at Pacific Springs, and the captains filled the extra water barrels on the supply wagons for the cattle. But that water wouldn't last very long for more than the 150 oxen, not to mention the horses, cows, and mules. Everyone had to ration their water. Captain MacArthur wanted to move his Dixie train as many miles as he could that day, because it would be another day at least until they reached the water of the Little Sandy. The exhausted Saints and oxen trudged on long after sunset. "When are we going to stop?" moaned Phoebe. This statement encouraged Fanny to whimper. "Are we going to walk all night? Can we sit in the back of the wagon for a while?" "I know you're tired, twinsies," said Susanna, "but think how tired your oxen are. They've gone all day without water. They have a heavy load to pull with all of our luggage and the pipes for the tabernacle organ. Do you really want to add your extra weight to their burden?" "No, but—" "Let's try to get our minds off being tired," said Aunt Lucy. "I can tell you a couple of stories about when I was a little girl growing up with my brother Milo," Eleanor's father. The twins perked up. They loved hearing stories. "Yes, please tell us," said Eleanor, who was more than eager to learn something about her father. It wasn't long after Aunt Lucy started relating their childhood experiences with Milo that she had all her sisters laughing in stitches. They didn't know she could spin such a good yarn, and in the length of time it took for her to tell the stories, the twins had forgotten all about being tired and had happily walked for another mile or so. As if on cue, the horn immediately blew a signal that they had reached the place for their camp. They couldn't believe the time had gone by so quickly, and they had had such a good time. But it was getting very dark, and they were all grateful to finally be stopping for the night. After munching on some well-done biscuits that were baked the day before, they didn't even bother putting up their tent. They just crawled under their wagon and went to sleep for the night. Each morning brought new challenges for the men of the Dixie train. It was rare when they didn't wake up to find 1 to 10 or more of their livestock missing, no matter how attentive the herders were during the night. Without complaining, the Utah boys jumped on their horses and went to round them up. The scouters of the company always rode ahead to find the best river crossings and the best campsites. Their first and foremost consideration for the site was plenty of feed and water for the cattle. On the first half of the trek, the water and grass was plentiful, but as they traveled farther west, the grass became scarcer and the creeks started drying up. The prairie grass had been eaten down by passing cattle, bison, or insects, and the hot summer sun had scorched what was left. The Saints had even seen evidence of a prairie fire caused by lightning, or maybe human hands. The Dixie train had to go farther and farther each night to find a camping place that would accommodate their cattle. They started to pass dead animals periodically along the trail and saw turkey buzzards and ravens picking at the carrion. The smell that permeated the air on those occasions was such that the Saints had to cover their noses when they passed. When they got to the Little Sandy River, the captains found that it had slowed to a trickle, and many stretches were bone dry. The Saints had used up all the water in their barrels, and there was no telling if the Big Sandy, which was 5 miles west, would have more water. It was becoming fairly routine to camp by a dry riverbed and let the oxen pick bushes for a living when the grass was scarce. Then the men who were assigned as well diggers would dig down in the dry bed a couple of feet until they reached wet mud. They would keep digging until the holes started to fill up with muddy water. After the water stood for a while, the dirt would settle out and the water would become somewhat clearer, even more so by morning. but no one could wait that long to drink it. The children, in anticipation, would form a circle around the men while they dug. When they saw chunks of wet mud, they would beg for a handful and then suck the water from it, straining the muddy water through their teeth. Some of the wells were for the saints, and some further away were for the cattle, which would humbly kneel down to quench their thirsty souls. The summer heat had been sapping their strength, and the cattle were quite wobbly for want of water and food. But dependable and steadfast animals that they were, they somehow trudged forward on the dry and barren trail the next day. None of the hunters who were sent out to shoot game had very good luck. There seemed to be less and less wild game lately. They would have to try again tomorrow. Everything seemed to be happening all at once. Everyone was running low on food, and the grass and water were drying up for the cattle. The only good news was that the road was easy to travel lately, but that could change around the next bend. Surprisingly, around the next bend, the Dixie train began to follow a road lined with telegraph poles. These amazed the children. "How can you send a message through a wire from one place to another?" asked Matthew. "Is it magic or what?" "They have a code they tap out, and the wire carries the dots and dashes to the next station," informed Otto. "They write down what the code says on some paper and deliver the message to the recipient on the other end of the line in the form of a telegram." America certainly has some great inventions we don't have in England," said Phoebe. Fanny became thoughtful. "Now, if they could just invent something that would pick us up and fly us through the air to Salt Lake City so we didn't have to walk all this way." The children laughed, and Matthew mocked. "You're such a dreamer, Fanny. You know that could never happen." The others agreed. Fanny really had a wild imagination. It was a good thing the Dixie train would soon be arriving at Rocky Ridge Station, where they could replenish their flour for the last part of their journey through the Rockies. Captain MacArthur wasn't happy at their prayer meeting that evening. "I'm sorry to make this announcement, brothers and sisters, but we need to go on half rations for a day or two until we get to the flour station." This wasn't what everyone wanted to hear, but they could see the wisdom of it. We're down to less than 3 pounds of flour, sisters," whispered Caroline, "and we haven't had any fresh meat since Hurricane shot that antelope last week. It's going to get serious if we don't replenish our supplies soon." The next morning, Captain MacArthur had the trumpeter sound the call for all to meet before they left camp. This was unusual. "I'm very sorry to have to make this announcement, brothers and sisters." He paused to gain control. "Our scouts have ridden ahead to the Rocky Ridge flour station and found that it has been burned to the ground." Everyone gasped and braced for more bad news. There is no way to sugarcoat this for the children, brothers and sisters. They found the charred bodies of the 2 men who ran the station in the back room. Horrified chatter spread through the saints. "The fire isn't fresh, but by the looks of things, the scouts figure it happened a few days ago. We're not sure who did this, whether it was Indians or someone else, but we are going to need to be very vigilant from here on out. We need all you walking men to carry your guns and walk on the outside of the women and children. There will be no more running ahead, children. This is Sioux Indian country, and even though they were friendly when we passed this way on our way to Florence, something must have happened to cause them to become hostile, so we need to be very diligent about protecting ourselves." This news was very upsetting to the parents and their children. Lavinia, however, seemed to be taking it very calmly, much to Eleanor's surprise. He continued, "This also makes it very devastating for us because we can't replenish our supply of flour. We will have the captains of 10 check on their families to see what the flour supplies look like. We may need to redistribute some of them to those who are shorter in supply." Captain Andrews was next. "We have another request. We have noticed that many of you have been picking up things on the side of the trail to add to the burden of your oxen. We are asking you now to throw those items back overboard as well as anything else you think you can get along without, and lighten your loads as much as you can, for your oxen's sake. We are noticing they are starting to get tender feet. Your oxen have been without sufficient grass and water for a week now, and when they fall down dead on the trail, I don't know where that will leave you. May we also ask you to pray in earnest that we will be able to find the sustenance we need for both ourselves and our cattle so we can continue on to Zion. The saints were crestfallen with all this bad news at once. We can make it, brothers and sisters, if we unite our faith and prayers and keep our spirits high. Our scouts figure it is only another 2 days until we get to Muddy Crossing. Let's hope there is water there and that it isn't as muddy as the name suggests. Another day of slow trekking passed with much hardship to the livestock and the pioneers. Nothing seemed to cheer them up. They were too weary to dance and make merry. They needed to preserve their strength, so they prayed for a better day tomorrow and turned in early. The next morning brought crying children, anxious parents, and worried leaders. Sister Schneider awakened early. She had made a decision in the night and decided to pay Captain Pinkerton a visit. Captain, she began tearfully, I'm sorry to report that poor Myrtle is succumbing to the heat of the long days as well as the rigors of the trail. She dried up 2 days ago from lack of grass and water, and I have been so concerned about her that instead of leaving her at the back of the train for the teamsters to herd, I have been leading her beside me so we could have a little talk. I did most of the talking, of course, because she is skin and bones and hardly has enough power to blink her eyes. As much as it pains me, I think we ought to butcher Myrtle and give what meat she has on her bones to those who are sick or in greatest need. Then, dabbing her eyes with her handkerchief, she added, In fact, I'm not so sure that if her meat were cooked up, it would even make a grease spot on a silk dress. This caused her to sob into her handkerchief. Now, Sister Schneider, he said as he put his arms around her and patted her back. This is so generous of you. Thank you for your sacrifice. I'll go tell Captain MacArthur. I'm sure he'll be happy about it. When Captain MacArthur received this news, he ordered some teamsters to quickly butcher the cow and called for Sisters Wise and Whittier to meet with him to decide who was in the most need of the meat. The Buttons have several who are sick in their families, said Eleanor, as if they hadn't had enough trials on this journey thus far. Brother Dibble has mountain fever, said Aunt Lucy, and there are 3 missionaries who have been too sick to walk or ride their horses. They've got fevers, sore throats, and terrible coughs. And I hesitate to say this, said Eleanor, but the sisters-in-law have been making such a fuss since you put the wagon train on half rations that if we could just stop them from complaining, I think it would do more good for those around them than anything else. I know we shouldn't reward their murmuring, but I agree, he said. Have your 7 sisters help distribute the meat up and down the train. We will try to give a small chunk of meat to every wagon, but those you have mentioned should get an extra half portion. We'll stand by for another 2 hours so everyone can begin our trek today with something in their stomachs. Thank you for your faithful service, sisters. Now let's get busy. We're wasting time. The whole wagon train rejoiced when they received their portion of meat that morning, and were so grateful to Sister Schneider that they couldn't stop praising her name. Sister Schneider didn't let any of the praise go to her head. She hated having to part with her beloved Myrtle, but she was grateful that her cow had helped revive her fellow suffering saints with her daily milk, and now with her very flesh. She could always get another cow when she got to Salt Lake City. That was the first good thing that happened that day. The next good thing was a little harder to come by. After walking for a few hours, the train passed 2 government supply wagons traveling eastward. These wagons were each pulled by 6 oxen and were huge compared to the covered wagons in the Dixie train. Their wheels were as tall as a man, and the top of the bed of the wagon was another 3 feet above the top of the wheels. There were no bows or wagon covers, but whatever was in the wagon bed was stacked higher than the top board, and the mound was covered with canvas. Captains MacArthur and Andrews informed the captains to notify the company that the wagon train would stop for a little rest while they went to see what the supply wagons were carrying. When they drew even with the first wagon, MacArthur spoke. "Afternoon, Sergeant. I see you have a full load of supplies and are headed toward the east. What might you be carrying? Are you interested in making a purchase? Depends on what you have. We've got some supplies we picked up at Fort Bridger to take to Fort Laramie. Edible supplies? It's mostly pelts and guns, but we do have a few sacks of flour. Really? Where did you get your flour? The soldiers at Fort Bridger said they stopped at the Rocky Ridge station to water their horses, and the men there almost begged them to buy the flour from them. And why was that? They said they needed to clean out the station so they could go to California. Were these boys Mormons? The soldiers said they didn't look or act like Mormons. They were rough and kept talking about getting a stake so they could go and dig for gold. The soldiers said they seemed to be in an awful big hurry to make the sale. So they went ahead and bought the flour from them? Yes. Well, my wagon train is carrying Mormons, said MacArthur. And when we got to Rocky Ridge a few days ago to replenish our flour supplies, it was burned to the ground, and there were 2 charred Mormons in the back room. That's alarming, said the sergeant. How do you know they were Mormons rather than the 2 men who sold the flour? Because the Mormons own it and are not trying to raise money to go to California. The soldiers acted like it was in one piece when we left the station, although they did report that after driving their teams for a while, they saw some black smoke in the direction they had just come. Captain Andrews chirped in. My guess is that those miners dealt some foul play to the Mormons manning the station, and then pretended to be in charge of it. When they got their money from the soldiers, they burned down the station to dispose of the bodies in the back room, and to make it appear that the flour got all burned up in the process. That's quite an assumption, said the sergeant. It could be possible, I suppose. At any rate, we'll sell the flour to you for what we paid for it. That's a raw deal, said MacArthur. The Mormon church put that flour there in the first place for their immigrating saints, so they could pick it up on their way back to Utah. It shouldn't cost us anything because it's ours to begin with. All I can tell you is they said they paid top dollar for it, so if you want to buy any of it from us, it will cost you the same. MacArthur was steaming, but knew the sergeant had him over a barrel. We'll be back in a minute with the money and a wagon, he said, turning his horse around. As he and Andrews rode along, Captain MacArthur grumbled, I don't know if I believe their story or not. The soldiers could just as easily have killed those Mormons, stolen the flour, and made up the miners' story. It's tragic either way, but we're stuck, said Andrews. Let's get our flour and be on our way. We'll need to send a telegram to President Young with the sad news about the station attendants, and let God mete out justice in the hereafter to the perpetrators of this heinous deed. The saints rejoiced when they learned their captains had purchased enough flour to finish their trek to Salt Lake City, and that Indians weren't responsible for the burned-out station. Everyone gave grateful prayers of thanks, but they still mourned the 2 dead station attendants. It was heartbreaking at this point in their travels to learn of such senseless tragedy. But now they had to move on to their next problem. What if there wasn't enough water at the next campsite when they got there? What good was flour without water? It was mighty dry and hard to swallow, that's what it was. The saints resumed their trek until nearly midnight. They finally had to give up hope of finding some water that night, and had to settle on an almost dry river crossing. The saints hoped the wells that were dug in the riverbed that night would supply the necessary water to mix with their flour to make something hot and warming for their bodies the next morning. That's the end of chapter 38. Over and out.